My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and for the past 6 years I've worked as a senior financial analyst at Cabot & Reyes, a mid-size investment advisory firm tucked into the 11th floor of a glass building in downtown Boston. Most people don't understand what I actually do, and honestly, I've stopped trying to explain it at parties. The short version is this. I get hired to find money. Not lost money exactly. Money that's been mismanaged, mislabeled, hidden in the wrong accounts, or quietly shuffled by people who think no one is paying close enough attention to notice. That's the job. That's always been the job. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a high school shop teacher and a part-time bookkeeper. We weren't poor, but we counted every dollar, and I learned early that financial security wasn't something you inherited. It was something you built, brick by brick, decision by decision. I worked 2 jobs through college, graduated with a finance degree and almost no debt because I'd planned every semester like a spreadsheet, and moved to Boston at 23 with $1,100 in my checking account and a single suitcase. By the time I met Daniel, I'd already spent 4 years building a career out of exactly the kind of precision that would later save me. I read contracts twice. I keep digital and physical copies of everything important. I don't sign things without understanding every clause. My coworkers joke that I could find a rounding error in a billion-dollar merger just by glancing at a spreadsheet for 10 seconds. It's not a superpower. Just attention. Just discipline. It's just refusing to assume good faith when numbers are involved. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party 2.5 years before that Sunday dinner. He worked in architecture, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembered small details about your day and asked follow-up questions like he actually cared about the answers, which it turned out he did. We dated for a year before he proposed at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date, and we married 8 months after that in a small ceremony outside Newport. Just 60 guests, string lights, and his mother making sure everyone knew which dishes on the catering menu had been her suggestion. That should have been my first real warning sign. But you don't see patterns clearly until you're standing far enough away from them. And at the time, I was standing right in the middle of falling in love with her son. The Whitfield family came from what people in New England like to call quiet money. Not flashy, not new, but deeply established. Daniel's grandfather had built a regional shipping logistics company in the 1960s that his father later sold for a substantial sum, and that sale had funded 3 generations of comfortable, well-managed wealth. The same law firm, Carrington and Boyle, had handled the family's legal affairs since before Daniel was born. Holiday gifts came with quiet expectations attached. Family vacations were contributions, not gifts, tracked carefully in a mental ledger that only Margaret seemed to have access to. And Margaret, Daniel's mother, had spent the better part of 3 decades positioning herself as the gatekeeper of all of it. Not officially. Her husband's name was on the accounts, technically. But everyone in that family understood, without ever being told outright, that nothing financial happened in the Whitfield family without Margaret's awareness, approval, or outright control. I didn't understand the depth of that control until I was already inside it. From the very first dinner I attended at that house, 18 months before we were even engaged, I felt Margaret sizing me up the way you'd assess a stranger walking into your home uninvited. She was polite. She was warm, even in the practiced way some people are warm when they're performing hospitality rather than feeling it. But underneath the warmth was a constant, quiet evaluation. Is this woman someone I can trust around my family's money, or is she a threat? I wasn't born into their world, and Margaret made sure I knew it, in small ways that were almost too subtle to call out directly. She'd ask about my parents' jobs with a tone that somehow made shop teacher sound like a confession. She'd mention, unprompted, how important it was for families like theirs to protect what they've built from outside influence, never looking directly at me when she said it, but never needing to. I told myself for almost 2 years that I was imagining the undertone, that I was being sensitive or insecure, or reading too much into ordinary mother-in-law dynamics that every woman who marries into a family deals with. Daniel adored his mother and saw none of what I saw. Or maybe he saw it and had simply learned, the way his father had, that confronting Margaret cost more energy than it was worth. Focused on what mattered. My marriage. My career. Staying out of family politics that weren't mine to navigate. But everything I'd quietly observed over those 2 years, every small comment, every subtle test, every moment Margaret positioned herself as the family's financial authority, became suddenly, urgently relevant the week my grandmother passed away. My grandmother passed away on a Tuesday in early March, and it would be another 3 weeks before I understood just how perfectly my entire life with the Whitfield family had been training me, without my realizing it, for what was about to happen. But before I get to the inheritance, I need to take you back. Because the dinner table moment, the accusation, the folder, all of it, none of that makes sense unless you understand what came before it. The inheritance wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the breaking point of something that had been quietly building for almost 2 years. Looking back now, I can identify at least 3 moments that should have told me everything I needed to know about how Margaret operated. At the time, I dismissed each one individually. Isolated, they felt like nothing. A misunderstanding here, an old-fashioned attitude there. It was only later, laying them all out in sequence, that I saw the pattern for what it actually was. The first was the wedding gift. 18 months before that Sunday dinner, about 4 months into our marriage, my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, a retired nurse who'd never had much money but always showed up for family in every way that mattered, sent Daniel and me a wedding gift. A check for $3,000, tucked into a card with her handwriting on the inside. For the home you're building together. Love, Aunt Carol. The card arrived at the Whitfield house during a family gathering, addressed to us but delivered to their address because we'd used it temporarily during a renovation on our own place. Margaret intercepted it at the door, saw the envelope, and according to Daniel, who told me this part later, almost sheepishly, opened it herself before either of us had even seen it. "I'll just hold on to this for you," she said. "Things get so chaotic during a renovation. I don't want a check like this getting lost in the shuffle." I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed almost thoughtful, in a controlling sort of way. But 4 months passed. The check never made it to our actual bank account. When I finally asked about it, casually at first, assuming it was simply an oversight, Margaret looked at me with mild confusion and said she'd deposited it for safekeeping into the joint Whitfield family account, the one Daniel's father used for household and family expenses, the one neither Daniel nor I had ever had access to. It took 4 months and 3 separate, increasingly uncomfortable conversations to get that $3,000 transferred into our own account. Margaret framed the entire situation as an oversight. "I just forgot to mention it, dear, things have been so busy." And Daniel, eager to keep the peace, accepted that explanation without much pushback. I didn't accept it. Not really. But I also didn't have the energy, 4 months into marriage, to turn a returned wedding check into a referendum on my mother-in-law's character. So I filed it away. Quietly. The way you remember a coworker who accidentally took credit for your idea once. Not enough to confront, but enough to never fully trust again. The second pattern was smaller, but it repeated constantly. The way Margaret talked about my career. At nearly every family dinner, holiday gathering, or casual Sunday lunch, Margaret found a way to introduce me to guests with a phrase that, on its surface, sounded neutral but somehow always landed smaller than it should have. "Claire works in numbers," she'd say, with a light little laugh. As though my career were a hobby rather than a profession I'd built through years of education and demonstrated competence. She never said, "financial analyst." She never mentioned the firm I worked for, or the fact that companies paid us substantial fees specifically because of the kind of precision I brought to their books. Just numbers. Vague. Easily dismissed. Meanwhile, Emily, Daniel's younger sister, who at 28 had never held a job longer than 8 months and was, at that point, between her 3rd and 4th passion project, was introduced at those same dinners as someone building her own path, or figuring out what truly fulfills her. Margaret spoke about Emily's unemployment with the same warmth she used to diminish my career, except in reverse, elevating uncertainty into something admirable, while quietly shrinking my actual professional competence into something forgettable. Noticed. Course I noticed. But pointing it out would have meant starting a fight over wording, over tone, over something that would sound petty if I tried to explain it to anyone outside that dining room. So I let it slide. Dinner after dinner. Comment after comment. The third pattern, and the one that stuck with me the longest, happened at Thanksgiving just 4 months before my grandmother passed. I'd mentioned, almost in passing, that I was working on a complicated estate planning case at the firm. A client whose family had nearly torn itself apart over an inheritance because no one had properly documented who owned what. It was meant to be harmless dinner conversation, the kind of thing I'd talk about with anyone interested in my work. Margaret laughed. Not unkindly exactly, but with an edge underneath it that I felt more than heard. "It's funny," she said, swirling her wine, looking around the table for her audience. "You spend all day managing other people's money, but I wonder if you've ever had to manage real money. Family money. There's a difference, between numbers on a spreadsheet and money that actually matters to people you love." Smiled. I changed the subject to something about the turkey. I let it go the same way I'd let everything else go. But I remembered. I always remembered. What none of them knew. What Margaret in particular had no way of understanding, sitting across that Thanksgiving table with her wine and her quiet condescension, was that I had spent 2 years, almost without realizing I was doing it, quietly studying exactly how the Whitfield family handled money. Not because I suspected I'd ever need that information. Not because I was building some kind of long-term strategy. I noticed because noticing is simply what I do. It's the instinct that makes me good at my job. In my profession, you learn to recognize patterns long before they become problems. The way a single transaction that looks normal in isolation becomes suspicious the moment you see it repeated 3, 4, 5 times across a ledger. The wedding check. The dismissive comments. The constant positioning of herself as the family's financial authority. The person who decided who could be trusted and who couldn't. Every dollar that touched Margaret's hands, I'd come to realize, eventually became a dollar she controlled. Every conversation about money in that family somehow ended with her name attached to the decision-making, regardless of whose name was actually on the account. So when my grandmother passed away in March, and her estate attorney called to tell me she had left me an inheritance of $84,000, designated specifically, solely and unambiguously to me, some quiet, observant part of me already knew exactly what was coming. My grandmother, Eleanor Hartman, worked as a school librarian for 35 years at the same elementary school in Westerville, Ohio. She wasn't wealthy in any traditional sense. She drove the same Honda Civic for 14 years, clipped coupons out of habit long after she could afford not to, and reused gift wrap from Christmas to Christmas because, as she always said, the planet doesn't need my carelessness. But she was disciplined in a way that quietly built real security over a lifetime. She maxed out her teachers' retirement contributions every year without fail. She invested small, steady amounts into index funds starting in her 30s, long before that kind of advice was common knowledge. She never spent beyond her means, not once in the entire 31 years I knew her. When she passed away that Tuesday in March, after a brief illness that none of us had time to properly prepare for, her estate attorney called me 11 days later. His name was Mr. Reyes, no relation to my firm, just a coincidence I noticed in the way I notice most things, and he informed me in the careful, measured tone attorneys use for these calls that my grandmother had left me an inheritance of $84,000, designated specifically to me by name with no conditions, no co-beneficiaries, and no ambiguity in the language of the will. Cried for 3 days. Not performative crying, the kind that catches you off guard in the middle of folding laundry or scrolling past a recipe she used to make. I cried because that money wasn't abstract to me. It represented 35 years of a woman waking up at 6 in the morning to teach children how to find books in a library, choosing discipline over indulgence year after year, so that one day, long after she was gone, she could hand someone she loved a piece of the security she'd spent her whole life building. That money wasn't Whitfield money. It had never touched the Whitfield family's accounts, their lawyers, their decades of quiet money management. It was Hartman money, my grandmother's money, and now, by her explicit choice, it was mine. Margaret found out within a week. I still don't know exactly how. I suspect Daniel mentioned it to his father in passing, some offhand comment about needing to take time off work to handle estate paperwork, and his father, as he often did, mentioned it to Margaret without thinking twice about it. Information in that family had a way of traveling directly to her, regardless of who it was originally intended for. She invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. In 2 years of marriage, that had never happened before. Not once. Margaret didn't do one-on-one lunches with me. She did family dinners, holiday gatherings, carefully staged group settings where she controlled the room. A private lunch was new, and that alone should have told me something. We met at a quiet bistro downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than the food menu. Margaret was warmer than I'd ever seen her, asking about how I was holding up, expressing what sounded like genuine sympathy for my loss, complimenting my earrings. I remember feeling almost disarmed by it, wondering if grief had softened something between us. Then, over salads, she leaned forward with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed concern and said, "Claire, I think it would be wise, for both your protection and the family's, if we moved that inheritance into the joint family account. Daniel's father has private banking through Wells Fargo. It would be managed properly there, by people who actually understand how to handle this kind of money. Far safer than whatever account you've got it sitting in right now." I remember the exact phrase she used. Whatever account you've got it sitting in right now, as though my entire financial life were some vague, undisciplined mystery she couldn't quite picture, despite the fact that I managed millions of dollars in client assets for a living. Smiled. I nodded slowly, the way you do when you're giving someone space to finish their thought before you respond. "That makes sense," I said. "Let me look into the logistics." What Margaret didn't know, what she had absolutely no way of knowing, sitting across that white tablecloth with her wine glass and her practiced warmth, was that I had already spoken with Mr. Reyes, my grandmother's estate attorney, exactly 1 week earlier. I had already opened a new, individually titled investment account at a firm completely separate from anything connected to the Whitfield family, an account with my name and my name alone on every piece of paperwork. I had wire transfer confirmations. I had a notarized copy of the will. I had email correspondence from Mr. Reyes explicitly stating in writing that the inheritance was designated solely to me, with no co-ownership clause, no joint account language, nothing that left even an inch of room for interpretation. Had a folder. A literal physical folder, the same kind I use at work for active client files, the kind with the reinforced edges and the little plastic tab where you write a label. I had started building it the moment Mr. Reyes called with the news of my grandmother's inheritance, not because I expected a fight, not because I suspected Margaret specifically would try something, but because documentation is simply instinct for me. It's how I'm trained to think. Money without paperwork is just a rumor, and I don't deal in rumors. Not at work, and apparently not in my own family either. I sat across from Margaret that day, ate my salad, smiled at the right moments, and let her believe, completely, fully, that she had already won. 3 months passed after that lunch, and for most of those 3 months, I genuinely believed Margaret had let the matter rest. She brought it up twice more during that stretch. Once at a casual Sunday lunch in April, where she asked, almost in passing, whether I'd had a chance to look into transferring things over yet, and once in early May over the phone, in a call that started about Daniel's birthday plans and somehow ended with her asking the same question in a slightly different wrapper. Both times I gave her the same calm, vague, technically true response. Still finalizing the logistics. Estate transfers take longer than people expect. It was true in the sense that estate logistics genuinely do take time. What I didn't mention, what I had no obligation to mention, was that the logistics in question had been fully finalized within 2 weeks of that very first lunch. The money had already been wired into my individually titled account. The notarized documents were already filed. There was nothing left to look into. I simply wasn't going to hand Margaret a status report on money that had never been hers to track in the first place. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I wasn't trying to provoke her. I wasn't sitting on that folder hoping for a confrontation, savoring some fantasy of catching her in the act. I genuinely believed by late May that the topic had quietly died the way most uncomfortable family topics eventually do. Not resolved exactly, just buried under the next 6 things that needed attention. I was wrong. Margaret doesn't let things go. She simply changes her strategy and waits for an audience. That particular Sunday in June, the dinner had been planned for almost 2 weeks. A relatively rare full gathering, with Daniel's father, Emily, and Daniel's aunt and uncle visiting from Connecticut for the first time in over a year. Margaret had been preparing for days, the way she always did before a dinner with extended family present. The good china came out. The candles were lit before anyone even arrived. She'd clearly spent the afternoon on that pasta, and I remember thinking, walking in that evening, that she seemed almost unusually pleased with herself, humming while she set the table, complimenting everyone's outfits, pouring wine a little more generously than usual. I understand now what I didn't understand then. She wasn't excited about the dinner. She was excited about what she'd planned for the dinner. We were maybe 15 minutes into the meal. Pasta served, wine poured, conversation drifting easily between Emily's new apartment in the South End and Daniel's father's recent golf trip, when Margaret set down her wine glass with that quiet, deliberate clink, and the entire trajectory of the evening changed. I think Claire owes us all an explanation about where my husband's late mother's money actually went. I've already told you about the silence that followed, the stillness that pressed down on the room, Daniel's fork frozen halfway to his mouth, Emily's barely concealed smirk. But what I haven't told you yet is what came after that opening line, because Margaret wasn't finished. She had clearly rehearsed this. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice level, though I could feel my pulse climbing. Margaret didn't back down. If anything, my calm seemed to frustrate her, like she'd expected a different reaction. Defensiveness, maybe, or panic. Instead, she pressed forward, her voice taking on that same manufactured concern she'd used over salads 3 months earlier. "It's been 3 months, Claire. You said you'd move the inheritance into the family account, where it could actually be managed properly. I've asked you twice now, politely I might add, and I keep getting the same vague answer about logistics. So I called Richard." Richard was Daniel's father's financial advisor, a man I'd met exactly twice, both times briefly, who had absolutely no involvement in my grandmother's estate or my own personal finances. "And Richard tells me," Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly now, performing for the table the way she always performed when she wanted an audience fully invested, "that no such transfer has ever been initiated. No paperwork. Nothing. So forgive me for being concerned, but I think it's a fair question to ask. What exactly has happened to $84,000? Daniel turned to me, his expression shifting from confusion into something closer to alarm. "Claire, what is she talking about? What transfer?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. She'd clearly been saving her best line for exactly this moment, and she delivered it with a kind of theatrical precision that told me she'd rehearsed it, maybe in front of a mirror, maybe just in her head during all those quiet weeks of waiting. She looked directly at me in front of his entire family. His father, his sister, his aunt and uncle who barely knew me, all of them now watching with the kind of rapt, uncomfortable attention people give a car accident, and said, "I just think it's worth asking. What exactly has she done with $84,000 that wasn't even hers to begin with?" Wasn't even hers to begin with. The phrase hit harder than I expected, even though some part of me had known for 3 months that something like this was coming. Emily let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind you can't quite suppress when you've been anticipating a moment and it finally arrives. and reached for her wine glass like she needed something to do with her hands. Daniel's father looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend his wife either. He just did what he always did in moments like this. Disappeared into his food, into his silence, into 30 years of practiced avoidance. Daniel's aunt from Connecticut, who I barely knew, glanced uncomfortably between Margaret and me, clearly unsure whether this was a normal family dynamic she'd simply never witnessed before or something genuinely alarming. I felt the old instinct rising in my chest, the urge to defend myself loudly, to demand Margaret retract the implication, to remind everyone at that table that I had a finance degree and 6 years of professional experience managing far more complicated money than this, and that the idea I'd somehow misplaced $84,000 was not just insulting but absurd. But I'd spent 3 months, maybe longer if I'm honest, maybe 2 full years, learning something important about Margaret. She thrived on emotional reactions. Loud defensiveness gave her exactly what she wanted, because it let her reframe the conversation as me being sensitive or guilty, or unable to handle a simple question. I had watched her do this before, smaller versions of it, at smaller dinners, over smaller disagreements. The volume of someone's reaction in Margaret's world became evidence of their guilt. So I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself with words at all. I set my napkin down slowly, deliberately, the way you set something down when you want everyone in the room to notice the gesture. I looked at Margaret and then at Daniel, and I said, with a calm that surprised even me, "Actually, I'm glad you brought this up. I have something in the car. Give me 1 moment." I stood up from the table. I felt every set of eyes follow me as I walked toward the front door, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor Margaret had refinished 2 summers earlier. A detail I remember with strange clarity, the way you remember irrelevant things during moments that matter. Behind me, I heard Emily whisper something to Daniel's aunt. I didn't catch the words, but I didn't need to. I already knew what kind of story Margaret had been quietly building about me for the past 3 months, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, while I'd been doing something far quieter and far more permanent. What they didn't know was that I'd already had this conversation, the real one, the documented one, 3 months earlier, before Margaret had even finished suggesting her joint family account over that bistro lunch. I walked out into the cool June evening toward my car, toward the trunk where a single folder sat exactly where I'd left it that morning. Not because I'd known with any certainty that tonight would be the night, but because some quiet, instinctive part of me had been carrying that folder everywhere for 3 months, the way you carry an umbrella on a day that simply feels like rain. The night air outside Margaret's house was cooler than the dining room had been, and I remember standing at my car for a moment longer than necessary, just breathing, letting my pulse settle before I opened the trunk. The folder was exactly where I'd left it, navy blue, the reinforced kind with a plastic tab on the side where I'd written, in my own neat handwriting, East Hartman Estate. Professional habit. I label everything that matters the same way I'd label a client file at work, because unlabeled documents have a way of getting lost in the chaos of a life. And this particular folder was never something I was willing to lose. I'd built it methodically over those 3 months, the same way I build any case file, chronologically, with everything cross-referenced and dated. I flipped it open briefly under the dome light of my car, not because I needed to check it was all there, but because some part of me wanted one more private moment with the proof before I made it public. On top, the notarized copy of my grandmother's will, with the relevant paragraph highlighted in yellow, the paragraph naming me, Claire Elizabeth Whitfield, as the sole beneficiary of an inheritance totaling $84,000, with no conditions, no co-beneficiaries, no language suggesting joint ownership of any kind. Beneath that, a letter from Mr. Reyes, my grandmother's estate attorney, dated the week of her passing, written on his firm's letterhead, stating in plain, unambiguous language that the inheritance was designated specifically and individually to me. I'd asked him for that letter deliberately, in the same week I opened the new account, not because I expected to need it as evidence in front of an entire dinner table, but because in my profession, you learn that verbal assurances mean nothing. Paper means something. Beneath the letter, wire transfer confirmations, 3 pages, showing the exact date the funds had moved from the estate's holding account into my individually titled investment account. An account opened, I want to be precise about this, 2 full weeks before Margaret had ever sat across from me at that white tablecloth bistro and suggested her joint family account idea. And at the very bottom, a printed email thread between myself and Mr. Reyes, 11 exchanges over the course of 9 days, discussing account titling, beneficiary confirmation, and final transfer logistics. Margaret's name appeared nowhere in those emails. Not once. Because this had never, at any point, been her decision to make. I closed the folder, walked back inside, and felt the entire table's attention shift toward me the moment I crossed the threshold of the dining room. Emily mid-whisper to her aunt, Daniel half-risen from his chair like he'd been about to come check on me, Margaret sitting perfectly composed at the head of the table, certain, I think, that I'd gone out to my car to compose myself, to cry quietly, to come back with some flustered explanation. I sat back down. I set the folder on the table, directly in the center, between the bread basket and the bottle of wine Margaret had been so generously pouring all evening. What they didn't know, I said, opening the folder slowly, was that I'd already had this exact conversation with my grandmother's attorney before our lunch 3 months ago, Margaret. The inheritance was never designated as joint family money. It was designated specifically and legally to me. I pulled out the will first, sliding it across the table until it sat directly in front of her. This is the will. Notarized. You can see the paragraph here where my grandmother names me, by my full legal name, as the sole beneficiary. Margaret reached for it, her hand moving slower than I expected, her eyes scanning the highlighted section. I watched something flicker behind her expression, not yet panic, but the first crack of certainty leaving her face. I pulled out the attorney's letter next. This is from Mr. Reyes, the estate attorney handling my grandmother's affairs. Dated the week she passed. It states clearly that the funds were designated to me individually, no joint account language. No co-ownership clause. Daniel picked that one up before his mother could, reading it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. I pulled out the wire confirmations next, laying them flat, one after another, like a dealer laying down a winning hand. And these are the transfer confirmations. You'll notice the date here, June 3rd. I moved this money into an individually titled account 2 full weeks before you suggested the joint family account, Margaret. Not because I suspected at the time that you'd eventually accuse me of stealing it. I simply did what any reasonable person handling an inheritance does. I documented everything and titled the assets properly, which you'd understand if you'd ever actually managed real money yourself, instead of just talking about managing it. The table had gone completely silent. Even Emily's smirk had vanished, replaced by something closer to discomfort, the realization settling in that the show she'd been so eager to watch wasn't going the way she'd expected. Margaret's face, and I want to describe this precisely, because I'd waited 3 months to see it, lost every trace of the composure she'd walked into that dinner with. Her mouth opened slightly, like she was searching for the next line in a script that had suddenly stopped being handed to her. Nothing came out. Daniel set the attorney's letter down on the table, slowly, and looked at his mother. Not at me. Her. You called Richard, he said quietly. You called your financial advisor to investigate my wife's personal inheritance, and then you accused her of theft, in front of my entire family, based on absolutely nothing. I was simply concerned, Margaret started. You were simply wrong, Daniel said, cutting her off. His voice calm but with an edge I'd genuinely never heard from him before. And you didn't ask me privately. You didn't ask Claire privately. You waited until Aunt Diane and Uncle Mark were here, until the whole table was watching, and you accused my wife of stealing from this family in front of everyone. That was the moment everything shifted, not just for me but for Daniel. I watched him in real time, recalibrate everything he thought he understood about his mother. 2 years of small comments, dismissed concerns, and quiet undermining that I'd absorbed largely alone suddenly clicked into place for him. All at once, sitting at that table with a folder of documents between us. Margaret picked up the wire confirmations with shaking hands, scanning the dates again, as though rereading them might somehow change what they said. "I just wanted to make sure the money was being handled properly," she said, quieter now, the performance gone from her voice entirely. "It was being handled properly," I said. "By me. The way my grandmother intended when she left it specifically to me, and not to this family's joint accounts." I closed the folder. I didn't need to say anything else. Sometimes the most effective response isn't an argument. It's simply laying the truth on the table and letting silence do the rest of the work. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The dinner didn't end abruptly. No one stormed out, no plates were thrown, nothing dramatic enough to match the tension that had just settled over that table. Instead, it ended the way most real confrontations do. Quietly, awkwardly, with people finishing meals they no longer had any appetite for, making polite excuses about early mornings, and leaving earlier than planned. Daniel's aunt and uncle left first, Diane hugging me a little too tightly on her way out, murmuring something about how families are complicated, in a tone that told me she understood exactly what she'd just witnessed. Emily left without saying much of anything to anyone, which was, in its own way, the loudest reaction of the night. The absence of her usual commentary spoke for itself. Margaret didn't apologize that night. I hadn't expected her to. People who've spent 30 years being the unquestioned authority in a room don't course-correct in the space of one uncomfortable dinner, no matter how thoroughly they've just been proven wrong. The real consequences unfolded over the following 2 weeks, the way real consequences usually do. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller, harder conversations. Daniel confronted his mother privately 2 days later, at her house, without me present. He told me about it afterward, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, still visibly shaken by it. He'd told Margaret, calmly but firmly, that what she'd done wasn't a misunderstanding or an overreaction born from concern. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate his wife in front of the entire family, using a financial advisor who had no involvement in my affairs to manufacture a story that fit whatever narrative she'd already decided about me. He brought up the wedding check from Aunt Carol, the one Margaret had held on to for 4 months. He brought up, for the first time, things I'd never told him directly. Small comments Margaret had made over 2 years that I'd absorbed quietly because they hadn't seemed worth the fight individually. It turned out Emily had seen more of it than I realized, too. Guilt-ridden after the dinner, she admitted to Daniel that their mother had been building this particular narrative, that I was financially irresponsible, that I couldn't be trusted with real money. For at least a month before that Sunday, dropping hints to relatives, testing the story out in smaller conversations before deploying it at full volume in front of everyone, Margaret tried to reframe it, predictably. She told Daniel she'd simply been looking out for the family's interests, that her concern had come from a place of love, that she'd never intended to embarrass anyone. But the documents didn't leave room for that interpretation. The timeline was airtight. I had moved the inheritance into my own individually titled account 2 weeks before she'd ever proposed the joint family account, which meant her concern hadn't been about safety at all. It had been about control, and the moment that control slipped out of her hands, she'd manufactured a public accusation to win it back. Daniel's father, who had spent nearly 30 years perfecting the art of staying silent during his wife's moments of control, finally said something too. It wasn't dramatic. He wasn't a dramatic man, but according to Daniel, he told Margaret plainly that her behavior at that dinner had crossed a line that couldn't simply be smoothed over with time, and that if anything like it happened again, there would be real, lasting distance in the family, not just discomfort. I didn't get an apology from Margaret directly, not in any real sense. A stiff, brief comment weeks later about, perhaps handling things differently, was the closest she came, and I didn't push for more than that, because I'd stopped needing her validation somewhere around the moment I closed that folder on her dining room table. What she lost instead was something more permanent than an apology would have given me anyway. She lost her position as the family's unquestioned financial authority. Daniel set a clear, firm boundary in the weeks that followed. Any financial matters involving our household would go through the two of us directly, with no exceptions, no joint family accounts, no advisors called in without our knowledge or consent. Emily, surprising me more than anyone, started talking to me without the practiced coldness she'd maintained for 2 years, eventually admitting, almost in passing, that she'd misjudged me based entirely on things her mother had said. And the $84,000 my grandmother had spent 35 years building. It stayed exactly where it belonged. In my name, in the account I'd opened myself, growing quietly, untouched by anyone who'd ever tried to claim a say in it they were never entitled to. I didn't walk away from that family. I still go to dinners. I still sit across from Margaret at holidays, and the conversation is civil now. Careful, but civil, the kind of peace that exists because both people understand exactly where the boundary sits. But I walked away from something else that night, something that mattered more than any dollar amount. I walked away from the version of myself who used to shrink a little in rooms like that one. Who used to let condescension slide because confrontation felt exhausting, because keeping the peace always felt like the responsible thing to do. What I learned that Sunday wasn't really about money, even though money was the language it happened to be spoken in. It was about the quiet, unglamorous power of preparation, about trusting what you've noticed, even when no one around you can see what you're seeing. Margaret spent 3 months trying to convince an entire family that I was someone I wasn't. All it took to undo that was the truth, organized neatly, dated, and laid out 1 page at a time. I think about that folder sometimes, sitting in my trunk for 3 months before I ever needed it. I think about how easy it would have been to assume I was being paranoid, to skip the extra step, to trust that things would simply work out because they usually do. They don't always. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to be most careful with, and there's no shame in that. Only clarity. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you.